this episode, I chatted with Kyle Borgognoni. He is a writer, editor, content manager, and DFS podcast host with the Fantasy Footballers. He's also the 2020 FSWA Football Article of the Year winner, a topic that he went into depth on. We talked about all kinds of topics, such as being with the Fantasy Footballers for as long as he has, the editing tips that you need to know as a writer, getting involved in DFS, and so much more. Follow Kyle on Twitter at Kyle_Borg. Check out his DFS podcast with former Get Real guest Matthew Betts, and make sure you follow his work over with the Fantasy Footballers. As always, you can find me on Twitter at TheCaseyCasem. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at GetReal_pod. You can find my writing with the Fantasy Footballers as well. Please make sure to rate and review this podcast, as I rely on y'all to help spread the word. Remember, this podcast is a proud member of the DAP Network. Make sure you go over there and check out all the great podcasts. Now, here's my chat with Kyle Borgognoni. Hey.
Yo.
Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, let me see if I can get my... And I love that hat. Give me 1 second.
Thanks.
I have a twins one that's kind of like
yes it is. Dope. Like it. You have style. Or I have style, I don't know.
I know you like some hats, and I've got some as well.
Yeah, I like the one you're wearing as of right this minute. Very nice. Yeah, so hopefully I have everything all nice. I've got a little bit of a weird setup going on, but I think it should be all right. Okay, so let's get started. The first question I have for you is basically the same question that I ask everybody when we first start out. It is, just kind of dip our toes in the water and just go over, how did you first start playing fantasy sports? And was fantasy football the first sport you played fantasy-wise, or was there something else that you played first?
It's actually fantasy baseball, and I remember in middle school, I would eat lunch as fast as I possibly could so that I could hop on our little slow as scrap school computers and play fantasy baseball and sporting news. And my friends and I would play against one another. And so, yeah, fantasy baseball is kind of where I got started in middle school. And then in high school, I played fantasy basketball, fantasy baseball, fantasy football. I was all about all of those. So yeah, that's how I got started.
That's an awesome. It seems like everybody gets started playing fantasy baseball first. At least a lot of the Matthew Berrys of the world and guys that have been around for a while. So it's pretty cool to see somebody else on that list of people who played fantasy baseball first. I've tried it. It's it's a headache for me, but. And you are somebody that I've actually never talked to in person before. So you're somebody kind of brand new to me. So we're going to try to learn a little bit more about you tonight. So we're going to talk more about your transition from just playing fantasy sports. Before that even happened, how did you start playing fantasy football? Was it a natural progression, or, was it like I can do both, or how did it go?
Yeah, for me, it's funny. Some of my first memories growing up were probably about 3 or 4 years old. And when I was four years old, I remember getting the paper and asking my parents, "Can I have the sports section of the paper?" Because I love box scores. And so I felt like from an early age that was just my section, and that my parents would give us. Open the paper in the morning, and that's what I would do. I would eat my cereal and read the paper, and watch SportsCenter. I started watching SportsCenter, age 6 or 7. Right. So I was always really interested in sports and sports statistics. I played baseball all growing up, and so I loved that numbers got to tell a story with the game, and so that kind of naturally went into football. And the biggest difference between playing fantasy baseball and football is obviously the games. 16 weeks is a long haul, for us that do it now and do it every week. But baseball is a different animal when you're looking at it every single day. And so I liked the fact with football, I could make the moves, I could stay engaged, but it also did give me a chance in high school to have a real life. I'd only have to look at it on the weekends at that point. Yeah. But yeah, so it was kind of a natural progression of, baseball was kind of my life, and I still love baseball today. I still do, but moving into football was kind of a natural progression.
Awesome. Do you are you still in the same league that you first started out in either baseball or football, or has that ship sailed?
Yeah, I some days I wish that I could go back to baseball, but yeah, I'm only playing football right now. I played basketball for a couple years, and I actually did pretty well in those leagues, but I gave that up since football is kind of my full-time thing. I was
Right.
actually in a fantasy baseball league with Andy Holloway
Oh,
a
okay, there
couple
you go.
couple of years ago. We were in the leagues together, and then we both just said, I don't know if we can keep this up with everything else going on in our life, but I do have a home league for football that's been going on since college, and that is still by far my favorite league. And I don't know how you feel about home leagues, but like that
Oh,
one's
I
just
love
the
them.
one that means the most to me.
No, I totally agree. I love my home league. Like it may be basic or whatever, but it's still super fun to just, get together with those folks and have a good time. So you what is your favorite type of fantasy to play? Are you a redraft? We'll get to DFS, DFS, Dynasty. Are you a little bit of column A, B, and C? How does it work for you?
Yeah, my favorite still is redraft, and I mentioned my home league, but I've never won my home league. As sad as that is,
Yeah.
I'm the one that does this, as my job, but I've never won it. And so that league means so much to me because it's so competitive. It's super fun. And that's actually how I got started in the podcasting world is I did a podcast for my home league, and it's still my favorite podcast I've ever done is, me and, there's 11 other people in the league. And I would get people to send in voicemail clips, just little voice memos each week. And I would spend, there's a couple years where I'd spend a good 10 hours putting that thing together where I'd figure out everybody's intro music and I'd interview somebody and have different segments. And so that was part of my favorite thing that I did. And so that league is still my favorite format. It's just one QB. It's full PPR, two running backs, two wide receivers, tight end, two flex. And then, yeah, we still got the kicker and defense, which if you
Yep.
guys know me, I love talking about a kicker. So it's a fun league. We switched to doing some keepers. So you can keep somebody for up to 3 years. And so, yeah, I love that league. There's some continuity in terms of players. I've had Keenan Allen for way too many years, but I love him. But I do love that league.
That's awesome. What kind of advice do you have for those individuals out there that want to put together some sort of podcast for their league?
Yeah, for me, I always tell people like it's when you're doing a league, you're trying to make it fun. Like winning is definitely a part of it, and I want to
Yeah.
win. Obviously, I haven't. Maybe that's my advice to myself because I've never won. But you're trying to get as much engagement in a league. There's no fun in winning a league where there's no trades and there's no talk during the week. And so having a simple podcast, in my opinion, is not super hard. Like anybody could really do it. You use GarageBand or you could use StreamYard, you could use anything and find somebody else in the league, come up with a simple little outline on a Google Doc. And I mean, people would look forward to Fridays in our league. Like I have so many people in our league, like, why is the podcast not out? Like I have my morning coffee on Fridays, with the podcast. And so it was just, it was super fun. And I just tell people like, if you want more league engagement, if you want a better league, then that's an easy way to facilitate it because people are already listening to podcasts in general and you can get so much more involvement. I always told people when you're in your car, take out your phone, get the voice memo or whatever app you want and record, a minute of trash talk or just some thoughts you have about the league. And if you send that to me, I can put that in the podcast and kind of spice up the clips. So I have some very, very fun, quotable memories from my friends that have just been from them recording stupid things for our podcast.
That's great. I mean, I love hearing that kind of stuff about leagues, especially like with the creative aspect of it all. That's awesome. So if somebody was to get into podcasting in general, is there anything just as an overlying blanket statement, the biggest piece of advice you can give to somebody who wants to podcast and maybe wants to start off by just doing their leagues? What is something that they need to like really look into?
Yeah, and I would just say the best place to start and to try it out is with your friends, because, we were putting that podcast out, like it was just, 10 of us, and we got to the point where we wanted to like, post it out. And so we'd have like family and friends that would listen to it. I mean, we had friends in other states that would listen to it, even if they weren't a part of the league, but that was the best place to start. And so I would encourage people, you can get a pretty simple microphone. You can use your phone if you want to, but it's just piecing that together. I had so much fun finding people's intro music. I mean, I'd spend hours just saying, okay, what do I want this person's intro music to go into their interview? And so there's just so many ways that you can personalize it. So yeah, you can get a, simple microphone, maybe 40, $50. You find that on Amazon. And what we did, and I'd encourage people to do this, is you can get your league to put that as part of their fees this year and say, hey, we're going to set aside $100 this year, and that's going to go completely just to podcasting fees, and it just comes out of everyone's, if you have a money league, just that's all that's going to come out this year. That way we have the equipment, it's in front of us, and we could just start. And so it's really just playing around with it. It's a lot of trial and error. If you listen to our first couple of ones back in like 2015, it's me and my phone basically, and then it progressed to us doing kind of video calls. And last year during the pandemic, like it was perfect for us because we could transition during that, especially the beginning of the season.
I really like the getting your league mates involved. That's really cool. We'll get back to talking more about podcasting in a little bit, but I want to know, how did you find out that being a fantasy analyst, being a writer, being a podcaster or whatever was an actual thing that you could actually do?
Yeah, that's funny. I've been a teacher, I've been a pastor, but I've always loved writing. Like it's been something that I have tons and tons of journals. It's just I write all the time. And so my parents, if you would have asked them what I would have done growing up, they would have said, he's probably going to do something with sports and with writing. And about 2014 or so, I started to get back into fantasy a little bit more serious with that home league. I was like, all right, I'm going to win this league. I've never won. I'm going to do this. And so I started checking out different websites, whether it be Fantasy Pros, started listening to Fantasy Footballers, 2014, 2015. And I noticed on Fantasy Pros, they have a section for a news correspondent, which is basically follow your favorite team and just write a blurb. And I was used to blurbs from places like Roto World. And so, hey, I'm already checking out all the games for the Falcons and the Braves. Those are my two favorite teams. So might as well just write. And I didn't even care about getting paid. I just wanted to be immersed in what the team was doing. So that was kind of my foot in the door of just getting to be around it, do it regularly. And I got to do it at my own pace. And so I've encouraged a lot of people. That's a great first step, is just, hey, you don't have any experience writing? That's okay. That's actually a great place just to look at stats and just give a quick little fantasy spin. So that was a fun little year and a half of just writing blurbs over and over again for the Braves and the Falcons. Sometimes they didn't even matter, they're fourth string wide receiver. But so that was kind of how I got first started in this kind of space.
And then you brought up the Fantasy Footballers, about how you had, started listening to them and everything. First off, before that even, was there anything between, doing the blurbs and being with the Fantasy Footballers, or have you been with the Footballers since, day one of doing this?
So I did Fantasy Pros as I was just going to write, and I didn't even think about getting paid. Honestly, mm-hmm. It was just like, I had fun writing out my thoughts. I'd write an article, every once in a while. It was a perfect little space for my life. But as I started podcasting for my league, my wife used to joke. She says, like, if you're going to spend time on this, you should probably get paid to do this. And it's probably true. I'm sure there's so many people on Twitter in the fantasy space that their significant others have said the same thing to them. Like, hey, you spend a lot of time on this. Someone should pay you. So from Fantasy Pros, I was writing just, every once in a while. And then the Footballers put out their first call for their writing staff back in, I want to say 2015. And I just happened to be a part of that first crew. I happened to come across the tweet, and, I listened to Footballers because they were fun. Like when I got back into fantasy football, the thing that I cared most about was I wanted to make my league fun. And these were the guys that I noticed they did that. So I was in that first call. I happened to make it through. And years later, Jason told me that when they were, putting those applications out, mine just stuck out for some reason to him. And he made me he's like, Kyle, I was going to make you one of our first picks. I was like, I don't know what that means, Jason, but it makes sense all these years later. But so that's how I got into writing for the fantasy footballers.
That's a great story. So being in that first wave of writers for the fantasy footballers, what kind of feelings did you have going into that, since you were, the first crew to come in?
Yeah, so I didn't know how big the footballers, much less the space was. I mean, I had, I don't know, 500 followers on Twitter. Like it was nothing. And on top of that, I just didn't really know the space. Like I didn't know the big names. I was doing it for my league, and I was doing it honestly just to be more informed. And so that first crew really gave me the opportunity to write, about some things that I cared about. But it gave me a chance just to kind of take a step back and go okay, what else is there? What else are people talking about in this space? Because I think it's easy to write about hindsight analysis. This player did that last year. I think this player will do this year. We all do that. Everybody does that. Everybody looks at last year, and then we kind of make some conclusions, or I like this player, or I have this hunch. And so that was honestly what I was writing, was just I like this guy, and let me find some statistics. Like Matthew Berry always mentions that, you can twist any statistic you want to kind of tell your story. So being a part of that first crew, I felt like I got to sharpen my skills from people that honestly knew more about fantasy football than me. And there's some really sharp people that have been around the industry for a while, people that started off with us that have done, really big things. Like if you look at kind of our tree, our fantasy footballers tree from that first year and a little bit onward, we've had people go to the NFL Network, we've had people with PFF. We just had people grow from that season. We've had Kyle Yates, now with Fantasy Pros a couple years later. So we've just had a lot of names that have grown. And so that's helped me kind of sharpen those skills. But honestly, Jason would say this too, it was a blank slate. I mean, the only people writing articles on the Fantasy Footballers website was Mike every once in a while, maybe Andy not really, and they had a friend. It was actually really minimal. If you scroll all the way back, and I've gotten to do that, it was not much. So we really got to kind of give some fuel to the fire of something they wanted to build out, and we were just kind of the green people saying, we're in.
And what's the importance of having a body of work to present when you're trying to, get on with one of the larger sites? Why is it important to put out content if you want to get noticed?
Yeah, every year we get thousands of people that apply to be the writer. When we put out the call, the guys purposely do this. They mention it one time verbally on the podcast. They never tweet it out. They never do any of that stuff. And we still get, thousands of submissions. And it's always interesting to me that we have people that send it in that have zero writing samples. I don't even care if you write for a website, but just anything. It's easy to knock someone off of I don't even have a Google Doc in front of me. I don't even have your college dissertation. I mean, I've had people send their college dissertation, which is awesome. I at least have something in front of me that tells me. I had someone years ago that sent me, nothing to do with fantasy football, but it showed that they knew how to talk about statistics, and that impressed me a ton. So yeah, with Fantasy Pros, it was great to kind of have this body of work of I'm consistent. I have a couple of articles here and there, but even people that have started their own websites, anything in front of you, you just need to start writing. And honestly, the best writers keep writing, and they keep writing, and they're not even waiting for an opportunity. And some of my favorite ideas I've ever had are honestly still in a notebook that I haven't told anyone else, that maybe they're crappy ideas, I don't know. But the point was just that I got it out there. I got it on paper. It's in front of me, and you get to develop it. So I would just encourage people, if you're starting out writing, if you want to, go to a bigger website, whatever it is, just, you need to keep writing. and not wait for, the big website. Like if that comes, that's fine. But if I never made it to footballers, I probably still would have done the things that I enjoyed, which is just writing and making my league fun.
And how has your evolution there? How has it been career-wise? What are the steps that you've taken over the years, and where are you now? And also let everybody know, because I know this is a more recent promotion that you got with the fantasy footballer. So just go ahead and describe that whole entire journey, I guess you will.
For sure. So I started in 2015 with them as one of their, just writers like anyone else. And it became pretty clear, and maybe it was me annoying Brooks or whatever it was, but Brooks and I kind of hit it off in terms of, and maybe it's my personality, but I love being able to fulfill needs for people and come through. And so if you know this about Brooks, people that listen to our show, like, he is just so selfless, never wants to make it about himself. The guys always try to, have jokes about him, but Brooks is just a selfless person. And so I kind of hit it off with him of just, how can I, come through for you? If you need any help editing, like, I'm a former English teacher, so I understand, what looks good and what doesn't. And he quickly kind of shared, like, hey, I've been editing our stuff, but long term, I don't want to do that. And they knew that. So it kind of progressed to a point where they wanted to offload some of that. And I kind of had showed some potential and filled in for Brooks a couple of times. So then I became the editor in chief, I believe, in 2017. Years are kind of hazy right now, but 2017. And so for the next 3 years, it kind of grew from, our writers would submit their articles, kind of like how you do, Casey, and I get to look at the article. I get to, edit any grammar mistakes, which we all have, and then make sure that the content looks good on the page, with the graphics, the links, making sure it's linked up. Andy's really good at that. I would actually tell people Andy might be the best person in the industry at getting you to our website. Like, he just knows how to put links everywhere that people land on our site. And my job was pretty much just that. And I liked it. I liked that it had its own space in my life. And I devote probably about 15 hours a week, honestly, 10 to 15 hours. And some parts of the season, it's a little bit slower. Once you get to like February and March, it's actually a great thing to kind of slow down and get some perspective.
Mm-hmm.
But then during the season, you understand it's like a grind where we have all of these articles that come out, and eventually I think in numbers a lot of time, and numbers telling a story. And so I just started throwing stats all the time to Brooks and to the guys, and they started making their way on the show. And I wasn't looking for, like, please say my name. I came up, like, I just found some numbers on the internet. And eventually they were like, hey, do you want to just keep helping us out with our show? So my job kind of morphed from just editing articles to in charge of the show docs with Brooks, where Brooks would build it all out. He'd have the structure for it, and then I would fill in all the talking points. And so that became, honestly, my favorite part of the job is, how can I set these guys up to just kill it? And what they're good at, there's a reason why I still like listening to the show. I cannot wait until I get that notification to watch it on YouTube, because it's fun and they flow. And so their job is to take what Brooks and I set up, and, statistics and whatnot, and turn that into a conversation, turn it into something that people really enjoy. So that kind of morphed. And I loved that part of the job. I did that for probably the last 2 years. And then recently I've become full-time, where this is my full-time thing, what I do. And I am editor-in-chief / content manager. And what that means is that everything you see in the Ultimate Draft Kit, everything you see in the Dynasty Pass, is kind of me making sure it's tight, making sure that it's filtered. So I know we're recording this and it'll come out later, but like when we found out about the franchise tags, about Allen Robinson, I was the one updating that, making sure all of our charts and stuff for the Bears was clean, because now we know, okay, he's probably going to play for the Bears now. So the content part is super fun, because I care about, I get to look at all of it, not just our articles, not just for the show, but just everything we do. How do we make sure that our content makes sense and that people are growing? And so one of the questions I get to ask all the time, Casey, is like, does this matter? Like, there's so many statistics out there, but does this matter for our audience, and does it matter for the people that love our show? So I'm still asking that today.
Well, I have a question about people writing and the errors and the mistakes that they may make throughout their writing or whatever. What is something that people focus too much on, and what is something that you think that they, as a whole, people could focus more on when it comes to making sure your article is written well?
For sure. What's funny is that I have to edit my own articles all the time. And so I always ask Brooks to like later on just look at it. But man, it's so hard to look at your own article and get kind of an outside perspective. And I get that. Like, so it doesn't bother me. Like, the grammar mistakes actually don't bother me at all. Even as a former English teacher, like I do them. I don't, on Twitter and when I talk, like I just kind of say whatever. I'm from the South. It's rough sometimes the way I talk. But I think what I would encourage people is, a lot of times people will say, I think that this player will do this, when really you should just say, this player might do this, instead of a lot of times we're inserting our own voice and we're trying to get people to like agree with us, when like let the writing do that. Let the writing accomplish that. But on the other side, we're often kind of dogmatic when we write, and I try to be a little bit more nuanced when I say, here's a range of outcomes for players. And I think that's actually a better way to look at projections and what we think a player will do. Like, it's great that you might have a strong take on a running back this year. You're like, I really like Josh Jacobs this year. Well, there's a range of outcomes for Josh Jacobs that go from probably being the RB5 to like he could easily be the RB25.
Right.
And I'm not saying that you need to say that every single time. Like, you want to be clear, but a lot of times we're often too dogmatic in how we approach things. And so I think it's good for readers to understand that. Like, people look at the indices and rankings, or they look at the rankings week to week and say, well, this gives me one outcome. Like, well, there's a range of outcomes all the time. And then I would say the last thing that I don't see happen a ton, but I think it's an important question, is when you're talking about a player, asking yourself the question, what have I not seen? Because whatever we've seen with our eyes, that's what we write about. But then when we ask the other question, okay, what did I not see this year? And I think it's super important when we're looking at context or we're looking at situations. Like, I've been trying to look more at offensive lines recently, not just like all the, I don't care to know every single offensive lineman, but am I actually putting that in my analysis? Like, or am I just saying like Josh Jacobs, he's going to be great because he's a great early down runner, when you're like, oh, they just lost 3 of their linemen. Like, they could easily take a step back there. And I need to add that into my context rather than just looking at his fantasy points or what he did last year. Like, the offensive line has a huge role in what he does, and that brings more into the analysis. It's another piece of the puzzle that I think is super important and allows the reader to go, oh, there's a bigger story than just Josh Jacobs. He's an RB1.
And what's your favorite topic to write about when you're writing an article?
Ooh, that's a really good question. I do like talking about range of outcomes. We do a series every year called The Path to Wide Receiver 1. And we've done that for about 4 years. And I love saying, well, what if this player goes off this year? What if you get some guy like my boy Marvin Jones, who I love.
Yes, we know that.
I love Marvin Jones.
Yes.
What if Marvin Jones was a wide receiver 1? And he almost got there. He was pretty close, but what could that look like? And so you're giving a bunch of scenarios for people, because you have your rankings going into the season, and honestly, like, they need to be pretty fluid. You need to be able to ask the question sometimes, like, what if I'm wrong? Like, what if I'm wrong on this player? So I do like talking about range of outcomes. I don't mind researching things that no one wants to research, like kickers. And so, and then another way that I like to look at data is I kind of ask a big question. And I think this is really fun for anybody who's a writer. Just ask a really big question and then go do the research and then let that do the talking for you instead of coming up with your opinion. So remember doing a piece a couple years ago. Can rookie quarterbacks sustain wide receiver production? So I was like, okay, that's a big, I don't know the answer to that. Maybe it is. So I looked at every rookie quarterback for the last 15 years and just saw what their wide receivers did. I mean, it wasn't like a complicated thing. And what I found out is like 60 something, 65% of the time, a rookie quarterback doesn't have a wide receiver that finishes in the top 36. Like that's pretty overwhelming that rookie quarterbacks can't really sustain meaningful fantasy production. So it's kind of like one of those situations where I'd rather fade the situation with a rookie quarterback, and it just took a big question to figure that out.
That's a great idea and great advice. And I want to know more about, since we're talking about writing, I want to know more about the award that you just won with the FSWA. What exactly did you win, and what was the whole topic of the article that you wrote?
I wish they would have given me a Chili's gift card or something. But I got a plaque back here. But yeah, so the article I wrote last year, I believe it was last May, was fantasy football and the evolution of language. And that had been another one of those concepts that I just wrote down in my notebook. I just have a notebook on my desk. And it kind of sat there, honestly, for 3 or 4 months. And I had a conversation with my mother-in-law, who doesn't care about sports, you know, but she had listened to one of the podcasts that I did. And she said, wow, that was really, really impressive, which, you know, she didn't know any of the players. But she said, that sounds like you're speaking a different language. And that started like turning some gears in my mind. Like, honestly, like fantasy football is a different language. Like you and I, Casey, speak a pretty weird language to someone else, where when we're talking about upside and wide receiver ones and ceiling, and you know, it's like, what are you guys even discussing here?
Right.
So that kind of got the discussion with that. And I have a couple of friends who are professors, and they're linguistic professors, and they've studied languages. One of my friends is just the genius. Like he knows like 4 or 5 dead languages, like just knows them, like can read them, wrote like books on them that are published. Like, dude, you're way too smart. I knew that language exists. I don't know anything else, but you know the whole language and basically how to speak it. And one of the things that he talked about is the way that language changes over time. And the way that you really see language is it passed on to a younger generation. That's like how you really see something prevailing and flourishing is it passed on to the next generation? Like, are there young people speaking this way or speaking these, you know, this kind of lingo? And so you can see a lot of old timey fashion, you know, things are just not talked about anymore, and they get phased out of our culture. And with fantasy football, that got me thinking, like, what type of things are we passing down to the next generation? Like I have 2 boys, they're super young, 4 and 1, but you know, what kind of thing, what would they hear if they heard daddy talk about fantasy football? And honestly, like a lot of the culture is one-upping someone else. It's kind of a macho culture, and it's something where it doesn't really dignify people all the time. And that's just kind of something that struck me. And I'm not saying I've been perfect at it. Like, I'm not trying to get on my high horse, but when you think about it, when we talk about players, it's like if they did bad, like, oh, I hate that player. They didn't do this for me in my one league.
Right.
And, you know, so, and you see it on Twitter all the time, people tagging players saying, you know, they played terrible. And so that's a conversation with the fantasy footballers that we'd actually had for a while. We talked about language changes. We talked about some of the things that we wanted to do. And when Yahoo and ESPN made that announcement, a little after that, was something that we were wanting to be on board with. I mean, I would say Mike was the one that had that conversation with us back in February. I mean, we were just like, okay, what are some changes we can make this year? And so we kind of sat on it, and I thought it was the perfect kind of mix for me to share some of that language, things that I was really interested in with, you know, how we talk about this. And, you know, I've got some great feedback. Obviously, I won an award. I've got a lot of people that trolled on it and said I was, quote, too woke, which my wife laughed her head off. She's like,
Oh my
you are the
God.
last person that I would
Oh
ever
my
think is
goodness.
too woke.
You're
But
so woke.
I know I can't help myself as a 33-year-old dad. But I wanted to give people some words, just a conversation to start.
Yeah.
And I try to say the whole time through there, this is the hardest part when you're receiving feedback, is I try to make it really clear. I am not trying to give an across the board, everyone needs to say things this way. Like, I do want to find a way and start a conversation about how we can dignify these people. And that's what they are. They're not pawns. They're not like, they're real people. And the craziest part is we talk about these people sometimes in such derogatory ways, but they're superhumans. Like, how can you talk down about Derrick Henry if he does something like, I mean, he's like 5 human beings combined into one. And it's just an opportunity for us to look at these people, to appreciate them for who they are, to not put them on a pedestal like they're real people, but to kind of dignify and honor them. So that was kind of the main thought process that went into it.
And how did you feel when you found out that you were nominated? Not even the winning part, just the whole nomination part.
I'll have to give that credit to Mike Wright, because honestly, I didn't know how to nominate myself. And, you know, I did get a lot of good feedback from people in the industry. Robert Wozniak, who writes for us, done DFS, he's like, dude, if you don't nominate that article, I will bang on the door of Andy Behrens and tell him that article needs to be nominated. So it's like, that's cool. I don't know how to nominate it if you guys want to go there. So Mike was the one that got to nominate it. And I felt pretty good because it had got some steam around the industry, but also was kind of far reaching and probably different than most other articles. You know, it wasn't like a week 11 waiver article, but that's awesome. I love that article, but it was kind of this broader cultural one. And so I felt thankful that I fell into that. I told my mother-in-law that she helped me write that, and she goes, I didn't do a thing, but I was kind of a perfect timing and perfect, especially with a lot of the things I think as a culture we've been insensitive to, and myself included. Like, I needed to shut up and listen. So I think it gave me an opportunity to, like, here's my say. All right, I'm going to shut up for a while now.
I think that's great. And it was a breath of fresh air to have something like that come out that does reach a broader audience. I mean, it doesn't just apply to fantasy football. It's like everyday thing to think about the way you use your words. Do you remember the first article that you ever wrote?
I remember this at Fantasy Pros. I wrote an article on Ladarius Green.
Okay.
And Ladarius Green, the tight end, I believe he was on the Chargers, and he was hyped. And I think he got signed by the Steelers. And so probably some hype piece about Ladarius Green, which never really materialized.
So to go from that to award winner over here and winning the award, when you found out that you won, how was that experience and what was that moment like?
Yeah, so I got to be on the radio with Brad Evans, Brandon Funston, Andy Behrens, and they just kind of asked me those questions on the air. And honestly, like, the talking part of the radio didn't really do that much for me. But it was like, I knew that those guys had actually heard of that article, they'd read it, and then Andy just kind of on the air, I remember him saying, like, you nailed the things that we were looking for. And I felt like it was a conversation that, if anything, brought us a little bit further ahead as kind of an industry and just into how we talk. And then afterwards, our Slack channel was pretty lit in terms of them going off. And honestly, I think Mike Wright was more happy than I was. Like, he was going crazy for that, and texted my wife about it. And so, yeah, it was a good feeling. And I think it was a good affirming feeling for me, because, I had just started in January of this year, this new role. And I think a lot of people say their dream is to be in the fantasy space. Like, I wouldn't say my dream was to do this. My dream was to be around awesome people and to have fun. And I get to do that with the fantasy footballers. And so I think there's a little intimidation and a little bit of trepidation in my heart. Like, this is new for me. I've never known this side. I've been a teacher, pastor for 15 years. And so what if this is not what I thought it would be? And so I think the award was definitely a little bit of affirmation for me.
Well, congratulations. I was so excited when I found out that you won. So yeah, I was very excited. Do you have a specific process when you go to write? Is there anything that you have to do in order to get in the right mindset to put an article out?
I will say that I'm a messy writer in the sense of I do not go in order by any means. I usually don't write my introduction first at all, and I definitely don't write my conclusion last. I throw down on a Google Doc or whatever, just like as much thoughts as I can. And I ask questions to myself and usually put in brackets like, okay, you need to find a stat about this, or you need to think about this. So I think part of my writing process is, and that's served me well, is that if I have an idea, it's out there either in paper or on a Google Doc, and I'll get to it later. I won't wait and say, "Oh, I'll remember this," or I will just try to get as much things out as fast as possible. In my office, I have this giant whiteboard that's basically the size of an entire wall. That I've just always loved whiteboards, and so that's kind of divided up into. If I have an idea, I throw it on there, and I have reminders for myself all the time too. So that's part of the process that I like, and I think if anyone else, if my wife saw how I put together an article, it would be a bit messy, but in my mind, the most important part is the idea, and the writing part is just me kind of expanding and drawing on that big idea. And honestly, sometimes I don't know the answer to it. And like I said earlier, sometimes you ask a really big question and it's okay if you don't have the answer. And
Yeah.
it's actually okay if you ask the question and the answer sucks. At least you got to see what the answer was to that question.
Right, exactly. And you also, besides writing, you do the DFS podcast over with the fantasy footballers as well. And I've had Matthew Betts on, and we talked about that. But for those that haven't listened to that episode or just need a refresher, or everybody should know what it is by now. But if they don't, can you go ahead and tell me more about the podcast and how it came about?
For sure. And I did listen to that episode. It was a great episode, by the way.
Thank you.
I think it was back in November.
Yeah, it was a while back.
So yeah, Betts, man, he's become such a good friend outside of just DFS world where, we talk pretty frequently. Betts is all the way up in Vermont, so it's like a different world up there
Yeah.
compared to Georgia. But the DFS pod, I had been editing all of our DFS stuff for a while. So in season, we've had some awesome writers over the years. Ben Cummins has done it, Chris Meany, Jake Seeley. I mean, we've had some awesome people write articles. And so honestly, I've been in that world. I've dabbled in DFS just playing over the years. But this past year, I got to write a little bit more. I would fill in if anybody was missing a week. Like I'd write the DraftKings article. The year before, I wrote a bunch of wide receiver cornerbacks. So I was doing a ton of the work. And the guys were trying to figure out what's the direction of the DFS pod. And the biggest thing wasn't the past was bad by any means, but it kind of lacked just that homegrown footballers feel.
Mhm.
And at one point, the ballers were just trying to figure out, like, what do we do with this pod? And I gave some opinions on it, like in one of our Slack channels, like, oh, here's what I like about it. Here's what I don't like about it. And I just offered, like, guys, I want to see this thing succeed. So let me know how I can help. And it kind of started from there of Mike, like, would you want to do this? And I hadn't really podcasted a ton recently. I'd done my home league. I used to do a little bit with Fantasy Pros. I actually did, if you go all the way back, I did some fantasy baseball draft kit stuff on the mic. And I would do some guest spots every once in a while, but they hadn't really heard me own a mic. And I wouldn't say that it's my best place. Like the way that I talk, honestly, even just my cadence, my voice, like sometimes I talk too quick. So I think there's a little bit of that. I think we all feel a little nervous. Like, do you still feel that way sometimes?
Yeah. 99% of the time. I mean, it goes away right away, but like at the same time, I'm thinking to myself, wow, I sound like a total dork. Quit rambling, So but is there anything that you do to kind of like calm yourself down if you're nervous, or do you just have to get through it?
So my major in college was rhetoric, which is basically public speaking.
Mhm.
And I wouldn't say that I'm the best public speaker, the most nuanced or most thoughtful, But I did have a couple professors, one in particular, that just he said this to me, and it sounded so stupid at the time, but it was right. He's like, "It's only awkward if you want it to be." And I just remember that for some reason that piece of advice stuck with me so much. Like, we all feel like we're the awkward ones when we're talking, but it's only really awkward if we want it to be. And
Yeah.
so I would tell this to students all the time. I didn't mind being an idiot or just being silly in front of the class, because I just said, I just assume you guys are the awkward ones. I feel totally fine. And part of that was just growing in terms of my voice and how I would say things. Like on the DFS pod, you can hear Betts and I at first, like, okay, we're getting used to each other. We're getting used to how we talk about DFS on the podcast. And you get a couple of weeks in, and I think we hit our sweet spot. We're like, this is about us having fun
Yep.
and us finding our voice and us finding our jokes and different things we talk about. And that's what makes, I think, the fantasy footballers so fun, is they're not trying to perform. They're just being themselves. And so for me, I'm not going to be Jason. That's not me. But for me, the way that I am is, I have some witty moments. I can tell stories. I love statistics, and they tell stories, and I love just like random stupid trivia. I used to keep a document of every single football player's middle name in the league.
Wow.
I try to sneak them in every once in a while in our show doc, just to throw people off. But so just the quirky stuff is me, and what was fun. And so for the DFS pod, it was something where Betts has been podcasting for a while, and then it was us just figuring out our chemistry. The problem with DFS is that when you record, so much changes during the weekend. So sometimes we would record on a Wednesday or Thursday, and by the time somebody listens on a Saturday, a player's out, or and it's just a different type of game than redraft. And so I think there's a learning curve still for us in what's helpful for people. And I'm a teacher. I want to teach people how to play, and I want to teach people how to fish. Like, I don't want to just say, play this player. Like, that's not very fun. Because then when you do well, you say, Kyle, you told me this, great job. Or this was bad. Kyle, how dare you tell me, to play Mike Glennon one week, which I did. But so I want to teach people, and I hope that comes across in ours, where I'm not trying to say I'm a big shot. I do have time, and I do have the opportunity to look at all this data and to give you a good decision and kind of teach you the nuances of how you can approach things from a strategy standpoint. So for our show, I think it's important for people to understand that and to take advantage. Like, DFS is a chance to start over every single week. Like, you feel the heartache maybe if you lost some money, but you can really start over. Where redraft, if you put yourself in a hole, you're like, oh, this season's over with. And I do love that part about DFS, is that you can turn the page. We get to celebrate with people, and then we'll tell them, like, hey, here's my mistakes. I love getting to own up on the next week.
And because DFS is one of the newer types of leagues out there, types of ways to play the game, how did you get involved with DFS in the first place? What was that moment where you were like, okay, this is something that I really want to focus on?
I think for me, I was playing my redraft league with my friends. I was in a dynasty league, and with DFS, I just wanted to play players that I couldn't. Like, it's that feeling where if you didn't have Christian McCaffrey one year, you're like, I'm getting destroyed by this guy. I want a piece of the action. I want to have that feeling of like Christian McCaffrey putting up 45 points. And so that was just part of it. And so over the years, I had played with some friends, played in tournaments. And Betts and I talk about this. We have the same story where the curse of DFS is if you have early success, you just assume it's always going to be like that. You're like, oh, well, I won $100 or I won, $1,000, whatever it is. And you just assume like, wow, I didn't even put that much time into this. Imagine if I put time into this, I am just going to quit my job. And that's not the case. It's not the case, because once you start having enough reps, you see that it's pretty easy to lose. And it's pretty easy to lose when you go on just hunches. So I started to research this from a standpoint of like, how do I construct my teams? And then I think what a lot of people aren't used to is, how do I pick the right contest? People look at what's on TV and the big, millie makers, which are still fun to play. And they just assume like, oh, if I just have a couple shots in there of the milli maker, I'll be great. When your chances are pretty slim because, you're probably a novice, you're playing with $200, like when this other guy's playing with 1,500. So I always tell people like, you need to learn the game by playing cash. And so I had to put myself in timeout for a couple of years and just say, hey, I'm going to play mostly cash and I'm going to figure out like, am I good at this or is this just like not really my thing? And so I had a year where I just stayed with it, and 80% of my entries each week were just really simple, like double ups or 50-50s. So 50% of lineups, I think I can be better than 50% of these people. And I was profitable for that first year, like nothing big, but like $1,000 or whatever. It was like, okay, well, wow, this is kind of fun. And so this past year was the first year where it was like, I can do this regularly. I'm, not going to be a slave to it, but I want to actually learn this game from a theory standpoint. And it helped getting to bounce my ideas off of someone for the first time with bets and to talk out some of those picks. So our DFS pass and our DFS pod is me just going through a process each week, starting on Monday, and then go through the entire week and say like, okay, I'm trying to figure this out. And by the time I get to Friday, I'm like, okay, I've done my process, and then I'll tinker with it on the weekend and figure out if I can win.
And you were speaking of bets being, there that you can bounce ideas off of. How important do you think it is that you have a good conversation, a flow of conversation with the person that you're co-hosting with? And what do you have to say also to the people who are starting out? Like you said, we're starting out, you didn't really find your groove until, it took a little bit of time. What kind of advice do you have to people who are kind of like, ugh?
Yeah, the most important part is our time before the podcast and after the podcast. Like that's just what builds so much camaraderie. It's the, text in the middle of the week where, he's watching some show and, and so that's the part that I love most about podcasting with bets is like, it's evolved from just us getting on the mic. And I remember being so nervous that first time. And true story, the first 2 times that Bets and I recorded, we lost our audio. It was bad. And so I felt like an idiot, like, oh, Andy, Mike, and Jason trusted me to do this. They got me some sweet podcasting equipment. And now look at me, I can't even like record this thing. And so that it was kind of those trials at first, but it really is the camaraderie outside that matters the most. And with Bets, us messaging back and forth and just throwing ideas like, hey, do you like this player this week? What do you think? And I'll go, I don't know. It's just kind of like that builds so that a lot of times you'll hear us on the podcast say, hey, when we were talking earlier this week or when we were off the mic, we mentioned this. It's interesting. People love those moments in podcasting. Like, hey, before the show, we were talking about this. My ears always perk up when I'm listening to a show and they're talking about a moment that's not, I don't know why it feels so sacred that you're hearing a moment that wasn't on the mic. So for your audience, but for the teamwork aspect, like it matters so much.
And having the Fantasy Footballers brand behind the podcast, how does that go through your head? Does that concern you any that like I really have to be on my game because I'm representing them, or was it like that at the beginning? How are your feelings having them as a brand behind you?
One, I feel super thankful. So my personality, and maybe it's just where I've been super blessed to be with the footballers, the last 5-6 years, is I don't really want to start my own thing. Like it's just I'm just not a branding. I'm not like,
right.
So it actually makes me feel so much easier that I'm not trying to like carry this thing. And I probably should be better at some of this promotion stuff. And I probably need to grow in that regard, but having their brand behind me actually gives me more confidence because I know what they're about. Like,
right.
We have the same values, and, I've had actually other opportunities where I could have gone somewhere else. And it was just the easiest decision in the world to go like, I know what these guys care about. I know that they care about family. They care about being, entertaining and just being accurate. And in terms of me doing this podcast, like I don't have to be somebody else. I don't have to like be crude. That's just not what I want
Right.
to do. I want to have fun on the mic. And so that's actually been an easier thing for me. There is some intimidation sometimes because, they're the footballers, and it's done. The DFS pod did really well last year. And at first I was like, wow, are we doing something special? And it was very clear. No, it was them and their name that really helped us drive up the charts.
But you guys have one of the best DFS podcasts. So if you haven't heard it, you need to go check it out because it is A plus, thumbs up, good stuff. You were talking about them being, the fantasy footballers and the, having the same values you do. And how if you're going to be a person who runs your own site and you want to have people write for you, what kind of aspects of a boss do you think would make for an enjoyable situation like your bosses that you have now? What do they bring to the table that you think is something people should look for in places they choose to write?
Yeah, so this is going to sound like an interesting answer, but I'm just going to give one that I think Andy's taught me a lot, and
Uh-huh.
I've just learned. But you need to be able to have somebody who's willing to say no. And what I mean by that is Andy, Mike, and Jason have a pretty clear filter of what they should give their time to. I mean, think about
Mhm.
how many opportunities there are for them, but really anybody in the fantasy space. Like you could do Dynasty, you could do IDP, you could, there's just so many different avenues and I think a lot of times people go so wide, they see all the opportunity, but they don't have a really clear focus and you end up spinning your tires and not being able to do that. So look for somebody that's clear in their focus. If it's, a boss or something you write for, it's someone you actually admire the way that they talk on Twitter or the way that they talk, on their families. Like, you get, if you want to, with Andy, Mike, and Jason, you can see them a little bit more on Spitballers, or you can look at some of
Mhm.
their old show after the shows. Like, those are the fun things. And I've gotten to go out to Arizona a couple of times and, stay with them. And so that's part of it, is just like, who are these people off the mic? And they're the
Right.
exact same person. Like, that's what it's very easy for me to say. I've said that on a couple of podcasts, and they're not paying me to say that. It really is. They're the same people off the mic. So if you're writing for someone else, do they have a clear focus? Do they
Mhm.
have similar values? They don't have to have perfect. Doesn't mean you have to agree on everything. But
Right.
do you see this person as someone who is not just all over the place? Like, I don't know. I've just talked to some people that are so bent on getting into industry that they'll do anything, but they're going to sacrifice their values and they're going to end up
Mhm.
sacrificing, what's essential. And honestly, what's essential is just being yourself.
And they are the poster children for, being yourself. And did you ever think that there would be a group of people in the fantasy football industry that would be like rock stars or like, like a boy band of, like, oh my gosh, and these guys are like, oh, my favorite's so and so. Oh, my favorite so and so. Did you ever think that fantasy football would be like this big, this entertaining?
Right. No, because I think the image was just, people either in their basements, which nothing wrong with that, but like just
Mhm.
some dudes and honestly, dudes talking the way that dudes kind of do sometimes. And it's kind of off putting and not very engaging. And it's not very, it doesn't give you a wide audience. So yeah, with Andy, Mike, and Jason, I know Mike would enjoy the rock star image. Uh, he would always say that, what he wanted to be growing up was a rock star. And I guess this is his opportunity to do that. And I think for the three of them, there's a lot of principles and things that keep them grounded.
Mhm.
And in the studio, they bring this up sometimes, but like one of the key things is to remember how you got here and to remember why you did it. Like
Mhm.
that just matters so much that they remember. And when they throw back pictures like of them back in, the bedroom when they used to record,
Right.
that's also for them too,
Mhm.
to remind themselves like, hey, we did this because we're really good friends and we like talking about football. Let's remind ourselves about that because they have tons of opportunities, and I love that we stay independent. Like we get to kind
Mhm.
of do what we want to do.
And when you tell people that, hey, I work for the fantasy footballers and this is what I do, what what are people's first reactions to that if they have no idea anything else about you?
It's funny because the people that have known me for a very long time, like me growing
Mhm.
up, family friends, like they go, that makes sense. Cause I always talked about sports and sports statistics.
Right.
I think for a lot of people, they understood that it was a part of my life.
Mm-hmm.
And, my best friends are the ones in my college league. So like they totally supported it. They all listen to footballers and, that they love it. So I think people don't understand, like, what do I do during the week, especially what do I do right now? It's March.
Yeah.
And what do you do? But there's a lot of fun things we get to build out. And my favorite part of this time of the year is you get to ask the really big questions. You get to say, like, okay, what's going to matter?
Mm-hmm.
And we're asking those questions about the ultimate draft kit. And so it's super fun. I had to have the conversation with my son, Houston, who's 4. We even talked about this today. And he knows that I go, Houston, what do I do for work? He goes, you stay home. I was like, well, what do I do? Do I just stay home? And he goes, no, you work for the footballers, and they have their footballer shirts and stuff. But he gets that I get to talk about football. But the biggest blessing in this season has been that I've got to spend a lot of time with my boys since they're super young. Yeah, I would just say that this kind of opportunity, me working from home, like I get to show my kids, like, here's what I do. Like they see it on
Mm-hmm.
my screens, and afforded me time to, um, people, I think in this industry, they talk a lot about, you got to grind, you got to do all this stuff. Like, honestly, if you find out a couple of things that are important, you don't have to spin your wheels and go crazy. And it shouldn't affect the rest of your life. In fact, I want to make sure that what I do, and this is what Andy, Mike, and Jason talk about, like, it integrates with our life. Our kids can actually be a part of it. Our families, respect us and respect, like, hey, they're not working. Like I'm done at this time. So I've really enjoyed this season. I felt like I've gotten to be present, with what I do with footballers and present with my family. So I am enjoying it. I can say 2 months. I'm only 2 months in.
Well, that sounds awesome. And I was going to ask you about balancing, family life and home life, and the fantasy football and work aspect of your life. What do you as a family like to do in your free time when you're not dealing, with, work and all that fun stuff?
Yeah, for sure. So my wife and I, because we're both teachers, we're like super early people. And this isn't like this is just kind of what we do. So we wake up at
Mhm.
5, and that's like sacred time for my wife and I. So, we have our coffee. We don't talk to each other at all, but we sit, across from each other on the couches. And that kind of 45 minutes to an hour is just like one of my favorite times of the day, where we're both just reading, and we both love to read. So that's super sacred to me. Um, with my boys, I mean, we like going outside. We like sports. Um, my 4-year-old's really into Avengers right now. So that's kind of fun that we kind of get to share some of that, or at least like the cartoon versions of Avengers. And then I would say on the weekends and stuff like that with my family, I'm pretty close to my family that lives 20 minutes away. So it's you know, going outside, going to, my family's house. And yeah, I feel like a lot of what I get to do with my kids feels
Mhm.
normal. It doesn't feel like, oh, all right, get the kids to bed so I can do my real life. Like, it just feels, pretty simple. But because we wake up so early, we also go to bed pretty early. So that doesn't sound as cool as I thought it would when I was like 18. But yeah, we right now it's like wake up early, and then we are actually really loving that Peloton life
Oh,
right now.
wow.
So that's like kind of our thing over the last couple of months, that we've both like, all right, you watch the kids, I'm gonna go get on the Peloton, and vice versa. So that's kind of the cool thing in our life right now.
And being in Atlanta, what are some things that when people come to check out Atlanta, has to be on their list of places and things and experiences to check out?
So yeah, Atlanta's an interesting city because we're here in the South, and there's a lot of, overtones, a lot of things, a lot of history, but it also wants to be like this kind of urban, it wants to be Los Angeles sometimes. It's not. Um, and so Atlanta as a city has some pretty cool things downtown, in terms of underground Atlanta, or some of our museums. Um, but I would say that there's some really awesome parks in North Georgia is pretty great in terms of the mountains. That's where the Appalachian Mountains start. So yeah, with Atlanta, it's weird because our sports teams are kind of spread out.
Mm-hmm.
With Atlanta, the Braves kind of moved out of the city so they could get money from rich people, and Falcons. But there's some cool music venues, and then they really try to transform Atlanta where it's like walkable, even though it's spread out.
Mm-hmm.
So there's some cool spots, some cool breweries. Some of my friends that work at breweries in Atlanta like will always hook me up with some free stuff. So between like the Beltline and some of the other spots, a lot of people know Lenox. So when they had the NBA All-Star game at Lenox, it's kind of like the big, cool, rich mall around. So yeah, I've lived Georgia my whole life.
Well, I've never been, so I've never been. So definitely worth checking out. We're looking at hub cities. So, what else? Let's see. Because there's just, there's so much that I'd like to know about you as a person since I don't actually know you as a person. Like I'm here having a conversation with him.
You're good.
Okay, guys. And I've never actually had a conversation with him, but we both, we're over with the fantasy footballers. So we've interacted that way. And you've been nothing but like awesome since I started being over there with you guys. It's just like the perfect family, So why do you think it's so important to like be a family with the people that you guys are a group, you guys are a clique, a group, a posse, if you will. What's the importance of being a family when you're
with the footballers?
With the footballers, yes.
Yeah, I think I mentioned it a little bit, but like the idea of having shared values. I think on like Twitter, you kind of get some overlap, and some people in the fantasy football space are just like, let's be buddy buddy with every person.
Yeah.
And there is some great community. There's also some like false community of like, hey, you've never met these people, and so you actually don't really know.
Right.
And that's okay. Like you're getting to know people. And so having shared values with a group of people that you do things day in, day out matters to me, because with your family, they hopefully love you enough to tell you no. Like that sounds mean, but like I love my sons enough that if they're doing something wrong, like I want to tell them no. And same thing with Andy, Mike, and Jason. Like I could go in a million directions. I have lots of ideas, but they're willing to say no. Let's like clarify things. Let's focus what we're doing.
Right.
In the same way, beyond just fantasy football and running a company, like I feel like there's things in our lives that we get to look at and say, okay, it's totally okay for you to go spend time with your family. Like, don't come in today. Like, don't do that. Like, it's totally normal. And so the way that the kids are kind of integrated matters a lot to me, because, my wife comes first, but my kids, like, and their dreams and their, figuring out what they care about, like that matters so much to me. And I love, even at this young age, spending time doing that. And so I think across the board, I think we care about those things, and we try not to let this take over and, be in the first place. Like this is not the end all be all. Being in the fantasy industry is not the goal of my life. But it can set me up to do the couple of things I want to do really well.
And with your kids, I know that they're young. You said 4 and 1. If one day they come to you and they're like, "Daddy, I want to start playing fantasy football," how do you think you're going to feel on that day when one of them says, "Help me out,"
Yeah, I'm probably going to eventually bring one of them on as a co-manager.
Yeah.
That's going to be super fun. Or we'll start just like kind of a little family league, and they can kind of try it out. So no, I think I'm going to love it. It's going to be hard because the way that my brain thinks is just like players and numbers just stick with me. Like, oh, there's so much from the 90s that I probably should delete from my brain, but I'm very thankful. There's a lot of baseball in the 90s that just sticks with me. And so I think it'll be me getting used to the fact that like my kids will not think the exact same way as me. And so I want to encourage them in whatever way they like fantasy football. What does it for them? My best friend, he just wants to trade. He trades more than anyone else I have ever met my entire life. That's what does it for him. He loves trading. For me, it's not. I like that, but for me, it's the player. It's the numbers that tell a story. So I want to figure out what motivates them if they like this football and come alongside that way.
Do you think that there's a setting that's, or, a rule is setting, anything like that, that isn't as popular right now that you think you could see being kind of the standard in the next couple of years when it comes to, let's just say, like a redraft league? It doesn't really matter.
Yeah, I would say that in terms of the way the league's structured, like we're trying to structure fantasy football based on what we like. But if we look at how the NFL is, like the NFL, has moved to 3 wide receivers for the most part and kind of negated a lot of the impact that, certain positions could have. So I don't love superflex leagues because I like imitating the fact that I could see superflex being more and more just like normal, like it's just a normal part of it. I do like the fact that first downs are pretty important. So I could see in terms of scoring that points per first down just becomes super normal because that's a better gauge than a catch. Like a 2-yard catch for Jamison Crowder doesn't mean that much. Like it's not that important, but a first down is more important in terms of the game. And so I could see that being something that is just there in most leagues.
And I'm going to give you probably the most important question, this last question, before we get to who you are, socials and all that jazz. Who is your all-time favorite kicker?
Ooh, that is actually a really great question. So what's funny about the kicker thing is maybe it's kind of how I like approaching things, but everyone ratted on it for so long. Just like, this is terrible. This is, you can't figure it out. And I was like, I asked the question, like, is this actually an unpredictable position or are we just bad at it?
Yeah.
And so I ran all the numbers and one year I found out that we were actually worse at predicting quarterbacks that year than kickers.
Wow.
Like, so, it really is kind of a week to week thing. Like that's how fantasy football works. So my all-time favorite kicker. So for the Falcons, Morton Anderson's kind of a legend. He's in the Hall of Fame and he kicked us to the Super Bowl in '98. So that's kind of like, but I would say I have a distinct memory of starting Jason Elam as my kicker. And he's, one of the guys that hit the 63, whatever yarder. Like, I just remember when I first got started in fantasy football, Jason Elam was my kicker one year and just destroyed. And honestly, it was probably a bad pick, but so I'll say Jason Elam of the Broncos. But I do love Rodrigo Blankenship. He's good for the sport.
Yeah, for sure. Plus, I mean, we've got these cool glasses. You guys can't see, but we got these cool glasses on. We our kicker homie over there represent. Well, Kyle, I'm just so happy that you came on with me. Like, we were supposed to do this a while back, and I'm glad that we could finally do it and get my stuff together. Can you go ahead and just, let everybody know where they can find you, what you're up to, and anything else that you want to plug?
For sure. So on Twitter, I'm at Kyle_Borg. If you go to thefantasyfootballers.com, you'll probably find my name on either articles or editing some of our stuff. And I'll just plug. So a lot of people know about the Ultimate Draft Kit. And one of the questions that I asked us is that for the experienced player, I think the Ultimate Draft Kit is something like, oh, that was nice when I first got started. And now I'm good on my own. But when we built out the UDK Plus, when we really built out adding on the DFS pass and the Dynasty pass, we had in mind the people that wanted to go further. Like they were like, okay, I want a little bit more. And so that was, a lot of the Dynasty pass was me and Mike going back and forth and just saying like, what would actually matter to someone who's looking at Dynasty? And if they don't even have a Dynasty league, like they want to get into these rookies and their production profiles. And so that was us just looking at that together. So if I had to plug one thing, it's the fact that we're stupid for offering the UDK Plus. Really, you get 3 things. You get the Ultimate Draft Kit, you get the Dynasty Pass, and then you get the DFS Pass, which I have no idea why we're offering the DFS pass portion. Like a lot of websites, which are great, and I paid for them, are asking you to pay $60 a month. I mean, we're asking for $60 for all three of those things one time. So it's a pretty sweet deal to get all of those things, and there's discounts. There's just so many opportunities to be able to get in on that. So it's a pretty awesome labor of love, and we update it every single day. I mean, that's what I do when I wake up in the morning. I get on my computer. How can I update the Dynasty Pass portion? So yeah, go to ultimatedraftkit.com.
That's awesome. It is a genius product and one of the staples of the fantasy footballers. So definitely check that out. Kyle, I thank you again for coming on. It's been awesome, and I'm sure everybody's going to really enjoy this. So thanks for joining, and hopefully, hopefully my Wi-Fi won't drop and I can actually put this out pretty soon.
All good. Thank you, Casey. Thank you so much.
Thanks, dude. Have a good one.